It's my birthday, December 7th, 1965. I'm 12 years old. I'm in a cluster of school children walking up a road frozen with snow to a little old regular Baptist mountain church for the funeral of a classmate, Bobby Darrell Sloan. It's eastern Kentucky, specifically the Cumberland Plateau of the Appalachian mountain chain. And of course we'd been friends, but not particularly close friends. He had died 2 days earlier, a victim of leukemia, I think. But there had been some sort of accident involved as well. I never really got the full details. Well, we arrived at the church and were packed in. There were all sorts of people there. We classmates were up in the choir section in front looking out over the assembled mourners. When the singing was over, the preacher got up. He started slow, remembering Bobby Darrell and his life. And then he got into the Bible and began to get wound up, flecks of white foam at the corners of his mouth. And soon there was weeping and wailing, and the congregation began to express their emotion, climaxing when they opened the coffin at the end of the service. I was terrified, blown away. After the family, we classmates were the first to file by the coffin to pay our last respects. I could hardly look. He was like a doll, a wax figure laying so still. I remember it being a very long and tearful walk back together to the school with my former classmates, and then a lonely, solemn walk alone up the hill to my house. My mother had baked me a cake for my birthday, but obviously I wasn't very festive that year. There was lots to think about. Over the years, I've told bits and pieces of my Eastern Kentucky experience to a variety of people. My 3-year sojourn in Appalachia in the mid-'60s has deeply molded me, and it's fitted me out for what I've become since then. On those occasions when I have told pieces of my story, I've often described my experiences like going back in time to the early 1900s. Yes, it was the 1960s, but in some ways, life in that part of the United States had not yet caught up with what was happening in the big cities and cultural centers of our country. There were cars and electricity and television, but the mindset and ways of the people were still as they had been perhaps for generations, especially with the older folks. For instance, I plowed a field behind a mule after school one day with one of my schoolmates. Now, who's experienced that? A few people maybe, but very few. I attended a wood-frame schoolhouse with outhouses for bathrooms and drank from a communal water dipper after recess. My parents loaned our Ford Country Squire station wagon to serve as a hearse for an elderly woman who had died. Her homemade coffin was hastily constructed of plywood by local workmen and transported by my dad up a holler to a plot donated by a mountain family. When I tell these stories, nobody disbelieves me, but on the other hand, I think it's been very difficult for people to relate to or envision what it was like. It's almost like they don't know how to respond. That's why in 2018, when I received my doctorate from Liberty University in neighboring Virginia, my wife Melinda, my daughter Andrea, and I made the 5-hour drive from Lynchburg to Knott County, Kentucky to visit this place that I hadn't seen for over 50 years. My brothers Marty and Steve and I, along with our parents who are still alive at this telling of the story, we remember those days from our family's perspective. My wife and daughter can now at least visualize what I'm talking about when I tell the story. So let me back up and give some perspective. Who I am is firmly based on my middle-class Midwestern American roots. I was born in Hays in western Kansas, the 4th generation on my mother's side to be from there. Both my parents were from pioneer stock. Some parts of my family had moved westward since settling on the eastern seaboard in the 1600s. There were also later additions from Germany, mainly in the mid-1800s, perhaps fleeing the troubles in the German regions of the time. These elements are what form the basis of my cultural identity. But there's also an Appalachian part of me that was embedded during those 3 years from 1963 to 1966. just as there is a Mexican part of me from my years spent in Brownsville, Texas, on the border from 1968 to 1970. Literally on the border. You could hit a baseball from our house in Texas into Mexico. Then again, I've spent lots of time since then deep in Mexico as well. But my doctorate in cross-cultural theological e-learning, my more than 30 trips to developing countries teaching Christian leaders, and my overall ability to cross cultures and relate to a variety of people really began in eastern Kentucky. From my birthplace in Kansas, my parents and I moved to northwestern Ohio, where my dad got a job as director of admissions at Heidelberg College in Tiffin, Ohio. There my twin brothers were born. Within a couple of years, we moved on to another college, Monticello College in Godfrey, Illinois, where I began elementary school. Within 2 years, we were off again to southern Michigan, this time to Olivet College. My dad was moving up the ladder in college administration. At some point, Dad had set his sights on a doctorate. But for some reason, the president of the college where Dad was working there in Michigan would not allow him to pursue further education on his own time. So when Dad was invited to become the director of development at Lloyd College in Pippa Passes, Kentucky, with the freedom to pursue his doctorate in the summers, we packed up again and moved in the summer of 1963. I was 9 years old when we moved to the heart of the Cumberlands and of Appalachia itself, Knott County, Kentucky. We must have arrived at night because my first recollection is of waking up in the morning on the couch of the living room of Cunningham Cabin and looking out the windows at the lush green mountainside across the valley. To me, it seemed like a child's paradise. And that summer before school started, my brothers, who were 6 years old at the time, and I explored the mountainside around the cabin. We climbed rocks and we swung on vines growing up into the towering trees while our brand new house was being built on the same mountainside just below the cabin. As time went on, I quickly realized that the people of the area were culturally different from my family. Though as a kid, I don't think I really thought in those terms. I just knew that we were different from those around us, the mountain folk. Some of them called us Yankees, which was a new term to me. Some remarked that they thought we talked proud, referring to our Midwestern accent and vocabulary. But I thought they used funny words for things like tote for carry, poke for bag, and slippers for regular walking shoes. I found it strange that older women and men called all children honey, and my teachers in all 3 grades, 5th through 7th, preferred to be called by their first names by us students. Philippi, which is Mrs. Wickham, my 5th grade teacher, Ruth, Mrs. Dobson, my 6th grade teacher, and Eugene, Mr. Hall, my 7th grade teacher. Now, in my educational experience, that was never allowed in any grade before or since. To give you some idea of the cultural difference, I need to fill you in on the history of the region. Now, I don't know much about the area before European settlement other than that it was a hunting ground for native tribes, the Shawnee, the Cherokee, and perhaps others. But there seems to have been little in the way of settled villages at that time. The land was just too rugged and farming too difficult even for these Native Americans. But in the 1760s, after the eastern seaboard began to fill up with English settlements, poor farmers and freed indentured servants began to drift westward into the Cumberland Mountains. About the same time, the arrival of mass migrations of a very different group, the Scots-Irish people from Northern Ireland, prompted the predominantly English-dominated regions in Virginia and Pennsylvania to discourage these new, different immigrants from stopping. Instead, they were encouraged to move on west into the mountains and form a barrier between the coastal settlements and the Native American tribes. So this group of ethnically different English speakers also settled in this rugged and isolated Cumberland Plateau. The two groups melded together over the years along with some Native American mixing to make up the classic Appalachian population. For the most part, time sort of bypassed this rugged area, and by the early 1900s, eastern Kentucky was in some ways cut off from the rest of the world. People living in the Cumberlands were generally poorly educated, often in poor health, and very suspicious of outsiders. However, the region did have certain resources needed by the rest of the country: coal and timber, both of which fueled the rapidly expanding U.S. economy. The late 1800s and early 1900s saw Knott County mountainsides stripped of old-growth timber, causing erosion and flooding. And here's a photo taken on Caney Creek near the site of Pippa Passes from around 1915. Look at the devastation caused by lumbering without replanting. Here's a photo from the same era of old-growth logs being pulled to a water source for transport. The deforestation isn't as obvious here, but look at the size of those logs. That's old-growth timber, original timber. This picture's from over the mountain on Beaver Creek, where I went to 7th grade. Once at a large creek or river, the logs were then floated down to places where they could be milled into lumber for the huge building boom going on across the country at the time. As you can see, water transport's often the best way to get around, since the roads in those days were either non-existent or very rough. Under the mountains, coal was mined to feed the great furnaces of the steel industry, as well as for many other uses like heating homes and offices. As a child, I remember seeing the miners coming up out of the mine shafts during a shift change with those blackened faces and, of course, those hard hats with the lights on the front. Even then I thought, oh my gosh, what a difficult and dangerous job that would be. There were even small seams of coal in the mountainsides around Pippa Passes where I lived. People apparently had dug out the coal as far as they could without causing a collapse in the overhanging rock formations. I remember crawling back inside such a seam near my house on one occasion just to take a dare from a friend. So that was the situation when in 1917, Alice Spencer Getty's Lloyd arrived via the Jolt Wagon Road into the valley of Caney Creek in Knott County. A graduate of Radcliffe College in Massachusetts, she had come to eastern Kentucky just a couple of years before in 1915, where she'd been living in nearby Ivis, Kentucky. This time was part of the era beginning with the Civil War, when educated, social-minded Northerners came south to offer education and life improvement programs to blacks and poor whites. So a man from Caney Creek named Bysh Johnson, Bysh for short, heard of Mrs. Lloyd's desire to help people in Appalachia. He knew she was over in Ivis, and he traveled the 10 miles or so on foot, barefoot I might add, all the way to Ivis, and offered her some land for a school. So with her mother and without her husband, Mrs. Lloyd moved to Caney Creek and established a community there that she named Pippa Passes, from a character in Robert Browning's poem of that name. Residents built her a cabin where she lived and worked for many years, and it's still there, now a museum dedicated to the memory of Mrs. Lloyd. And you can visit it and even go inside if you talk to the right people. There are still bullet holes in the walls where early on, some local residents, suspicious of her goals and methods, tried to kill her or at least scare her away. And of course, they failed. In 1919, Mrs. Lloyd was reinforced by Miss June Buchanan of Syracuse, New York, who was inspired by news of the project. From reforestation projects to many fundraising tours of the eastern states with mountain youth, to a visit with Mrs. Herbert Hoover in the White House, the women worked tirelessly together for many years. Both Mrs. Lloyd and Miss June would spend the rest of their lives working in Appalachia. Mrs. Lloyd eventually focused on the educational side of the project, establishing what was now, and what is now, Alice Lloyd College, which has always provided free tuition to youth from the region. Now, this astounding accomplishment was made possible through donations that came in from the thousands of personal letters to friends and contacts written by Mrs. Lloyd, along with a mandatory work program for each student to run the college. She also recruited teachers from outside Appalachia to staff the elementary schools and the college faculty that Mrs. Lloyd established. She even appeared on the popular This Is Your Life program with Ralph Edwards on national TV in 1953. At a time when the college was about to go under financially, her inspiring story on national television brought in the needed funds to continue, nearly $250,000 in that one episode. Mrs. Lloyd died in 1961, 2 years before my family arrived. June Buchanan worked on the health and community side of things through the Caney Creek Community Center. June was the grand old lady of the area until her death in 1988. And I personally remember her vividly. She seemed to take a shine to me as she did with many of the other children. But as I remember it, she gave me a pair of tennis shoes from the new clothes donations that the community center often received. I didn't really need the shoes that badly, but she wanted me to have them, so I didn't protest. Sometimes when my mother was busy, she would send us boys down to eat at Hunga Din, which was the name the college dining hall adopted for itself. Of course, this was a play on Rudyard Kipling's poem Gunga Din that the students were studying. On several of those occasions, Miss June called my brothers and me over to her table to eat. Now, maybe she thought we were entertaining or cute, but maybe it was just to keep an eye on us. So we arrived, the 5 Bogarts, in the summer of 1963. Midwesterners transplanted not only into a different culture, but it would seem almost into a different time. We lived first in Cunningham Cabin, then in a brand new split-level house just below it. We went to an 8-room grade school, complete with outhouses, gas-burning stoves, and a dirt basketball court. At the time, Kentucky was near the bottom in terms of state rankings for education. There had been a saying in the previous years concerning Kentucky's status in the United States educational pecking order that went something like this: "Thank God for Alabama." They were the rock bottom. My folks, who placed a high value on education, were of course alarmed because my brothers and I were falling behind in our schooling. That was no reflection on our teachers. They worked hard. It was just the system. At school, I made friends like Paul and Hayes Sloan, and a kid named Delmer, who invited me to spend an afternoon with him after school one spring day. Delmer was a big, lanky kid in overalls. So first we helped his father shoe the family mule. Then we jumped onto its bare back and rode it up the creek to his married sister's place, where we hitched up and plowed her field for planting potatoes. When I was in 5th grade, Delmer was in 6th. When I was in 6th grade, Delmer was in my 6th grade class. When I was in 7th grade, Delmer was still back in 6th. I remember him in my class just laying his head on his desk after lunch and snoozing the whole afternoon. For all I know, he was still there for years in that last desk in the row that had been behind me. While my brothers and I made friends in school and my parents enjoyed colleagues among the faculty and staff, we were always outsiders, and no friendships or shared experiences could really change that. The mountain folk could be kind and generous to a fault, but they were clannish and very conscious of who was and who was not part of their circle. I think my mother suffered the most acutely from this divide. Looking back, I realized that she was isolated and lonely, trying to raise 3 boys, at times all on her own. As director of development for the college, my dad spent extended periods traveling the country, meeting with wealthy people who perhaps were interested in supporting the college, people like the Ketterings and the Butlers. He also designed the college logo and motto. The motto is "A Light Unto the Mountains," as well as he named the college choir the Voices of Appalachia. All of that was a fulfilling and interesting experience for him, but it left my mother to cope with a world that was very different from what she was used to, and of course without a lot of family support. Besides, as a Kansan from the wide open spaces of the Great Plains, my mother increasingly felt suffocated by the narrow Caney Creek Valley and by our distance from family. I can't exactly remember the order of events, but in the winter of 64-65, my mom seems to have had enough. My folks packed us up and drove us to Kansas, where they dropped us off with a couple of our aunts while they went on an extended fundraising trip to the West Coast. Mom had arranged with our teachers to provide study assignments for us while we were away, and our aunts faithfully supervised our study times. That was a bitter winter on the plains. Some days we didn't go out at all, snowdrifts blocking the doors and the landscape a gray-blue even at noon. But when we returned to Kentucky in the spring, we were somehow behind in our work. At the end of the school year, the principal insisted that all three of us be held back in our grades. Well, Mom refused to allow this, and dissatisfied with the Caney Creek School anyway, and probably bored out of her gourd, she accepted a first-grade teaching job at Beaver Creek School, some 30 miles away, where she enrolled us into the next grades. And for me, this was 7th grade. I have more vivid memories of that last year, getting up in the dark during the long winter months, Mom putting steaming oatmeal filled with raisins in front of us. And then we bundled up and out into the bitter cold and down a steep flight of stone steps cut into the mountainside and across the college campus to a garage down on the valley floor where we had a car parked. Then it was a 30-minute drive on icy mountain roads to Beaver Creek School. Once we swerved to miss something in the road and ended up sliding 360 degrees in the road, a complete circle, and landed in a snowdrift. Fortunately, we were able to back out and continue on to school. And I didn't realize it at the time, but as the crow flies, Beaver Creek School is only about 5 miles from Caney Creek. It's just that you had to travel the winding valleys the long way around to get there. In that same year, Mom had a bout with Bell's palsy, and I'm sure it was the stress finally catching up with her. She also caught pneumonia and had to be hospitalized in the Miners Hospital in nearby McDowell, Kentucky. I was very worried that we would lose her, but she eventually recovered. Within that same year, I was also hospitalized there. I had stepped on a sharp stick in a lake early in the summer before, and my foot had become very badly infected, badly enough to spend several days in the hospital. I understand that this Miners Hospital where Mom and I spent time is now abandoned. I think after that very difficult year for Mom, she convinced my dad it was time to move on. Then again, I think they had already agreed that 3 years was about the max of what they were willing to give to that region. They wanted us all to re-enter the mainstream of what was happening in our country, which we did. And for his part, Dad was anxious to devote his full time to the doctoral studies that he'd begun part-time. So after 3 years, we moved yet again, this time to Texas. We spent 1966 through 68 in Austin, Texas, where Dad completed his doctorate at the University of Texas. And of course, there were other memories after that. Times in Brownsville, Texas, and later in Arizona, and on into California. Other memories of Eastern Kentucky. November 22nd, 1963. It was a Friday. I was in 5th grade. I'd just finished school for the week and had walked up that gravel road from the school to our house. When I got home, my mother was sobbing. I thought maybe something had happened to my dad. I remember saying, "What's wrong, Mom? What's wrong?" When she could finally speak, she managed to say, "They've shot the president." The Kennedy assassination was my first real thought about the world of politics. And I can't remember whether it was the next day, Saturday, or the next week, but either way, the combined grade school and high school assembled in the high school gymnasium to be told what had happened and to pray for our country. Speaking of prayer, I first chose Christian faith at Caney Baptist Church. My family had attended church in the other places that we had lived, but that little Southern Baptist church deep in the mountains was too different for my folks. We had tried a church or two in the nearby county seat of Hindman, but nothing really seemed to work for them at that time. So from time to time, I attended Caney Baptist with friends. And none of it made much sense to this 10-year-old until the preacher explained that a person must choose Jesus. His death on the cross to redeem us was not automatic for everybody. A person had to want redemption, had to receive Jesus personally. And that did make sense to me, and I did just that. I had no idea what to do next, and in my teen years I experimented with all sorts of philosophies and ideas, But when I finally made my adult choice to follow Christ in college during the Jesus movement, that choice was based upon my decision at Caney Baptist. While at church, I can remember another prominent person of the area, Commodore Sloan, who led music and loved to sing Amazing Grace, I would guess every single time I was there. No, he wasn't a naval officer. I guess his parents just liked the sound of Commodore, so that was his name. Years before his father had been killed during that heavy logging period in the region, but Commodore grew up to be a deeply respected person, especially after he gave up carousing and feuding with rival clans. He was instrumental in helping Mrs. Lloyd and June Buchanan in the early days of the college and community center. And today, there is a building on campus named for him, the Commodore Sloan Building. Here's some more memories. Sledding down the road past the Caney Baptist Church. One winter day, my brother Steve and I got our sleds out and trudged down the road from where we lived and then up the icy road towards Hindman past the Caney Baptist Church. We wanted a fun ride. I don't know where my other brother Marty was. For some reason, he didn't come along. Steve went down first on his sled and then stopped abruptly at the bottom. I followed close behind but couldn't stop and ran into the back of his sled, knocking him forward and chipping off one of his front teeth. I remember walking home, Steve holding the chip in his hand, hoping that Mom could glue it back on. Obviously, that didn't happen. And Steve didn't get that tooth capped until years later. I remember soup, beans, greens, and corn pone, the staples in the mountain diet. We ate them at school, we ate them in the college dining hall, we ate them at friends' houses, but not at home. Mom kept to her Midwestern roots in terms of cooking. Once in a while, I would be invited to spend the night at a friend's house. My friends' moms would serve these staples as well as pork chops, fried potatoes, gravy, sometimes for breakfast even. And speaking of food, the summer before we moved to Texas, Dad had traveled there to begin his doctoral studies at the University of Texas. In the process, he had discovered Mexican food. That next year, Dad introduced us while we were still in Kentucky to the best version of Mexican food we could get in that region in 1965, Fritos or Doritos, which were fairly new to us, with melted cheese and Louisiana hot sauce, our best approximation of nachos. Moving to Texas opened up the world of Mexican food, and how we have enjoyed that since then. Spending afternoons and weekends collecting leaves and flowers for my 7th grade mountain plants project is another memory. I found a rare jack-in-the-pulpit flower, you guessed it, behind the Caney Baptist Church. I remember catching tadpoles and collecting empty pop bottles like Coke, Pepsi, Royal Crown, and 7-Up in the creek. You could get a penny per bottle if you turned them in at the local Ma and Pa store. I'd collect my money and then turn around and buy just as much candy as I could. I also bought cigarettes. First from my dad when he would send me down to the store with a quarter, which is what they cost then. Then on my own. I figured if they accepted me buying for my dad, they wouldn't know the difference if I bought for myself. And yes, for a brief time, I was a 10 or 11-year-old smoker. But thankfully, it didn't last because I kept getting caught by my mom. My love for country music was inspired by the blaring jukebox from that same Ma and Pa store. Ring of Fire and Stand By Your Man are etched into my brain from that time. I remember the annual Christmas Pretties project run by Edith Hayes, wife of then-President Will Hayes, and I think a woman named Rilda, and I believe her last name was Watson. People from across the United States would send candy, toys, clothes, shoes, and other items to be put in packages and then given to impoverished kids from the mountain area through local schools. The building that housed the Christmas Pretties collection was just below our house, so I gained entrance from time to time when the workers were there and often was given a piece of candy. I remember the school uniforms, not at my school, but at the college a strict dress code applied to all students. The boys were required to wear dark slacks, dress shirts and tie, and jacket to class and meals. I vividly remember my dad standing in front of the bathroom mirror in our home, teaching a new male student how to tie a Windsor knot in his tie. The kid had never worn a tie in his life before that. The girls had to wear a white skirt and a white midi top with a red tie. Even as a kid, I thought they looked kind of hideous. And I think the college girls really agreed with that. And though I didn't have extensive contact with them, I vividly recall several of the college faculty and staff. The head of the maintenance at the college was Tote Jacobs. It was Tote who constructed the coffin for that elderly woman who had died and whose coffin was transported by my dad in our station wagon. Tote even appeared on a reprise of This Is Your Life in the late 70s in honor of June Buchanan this time. He it was who remarked to my dad one time when Dad was wanting something done pretty quickly. He said something like this, "Remember, young man, Rome weren't built in a day." Then there was Ebba Swanson from Wisconsin, my dad's secretary. When she first came to the college, she moved into a brand new apartment that had been built for her. And as the workmen were finishing up the last details, she just thought to ask them, "How do you lock these windows?" A bit puzzled, they replied, "Ma'am, we lock 'em fine." No. How do you lock these windows?" she said. "Well, ma'am, we lock 'em fine." "No, I mean, how do you lock them? Fasten the windows shut so they won't open." "Oh, well, just slide this here lever." There was Bill Cohen, the Jewish teacher who taught English and composed a haiku poem about my brothers and I playing outside our home. A boy and a dog jump over a log, joy. There was Abner Grender, who was a marvelous music and choir teacher, but he was hard of hearing. I still marvel at how he got such amazing music out of those students. At the time, the faculty was recruited from all over the United States, some joining the faculty because they wanted to make a difference for mountain kids, and others simply because it was basically what was available to them. As a result, the faculty was a hodgepodge of personality and temperament and background. My dad used to say, "Pippa Passes is so small that we don't have a permanent village idiot, so we all have to take turns. And today's my day." Sometime during our stay, I'm guessing in 1965 or early 1966, Look magazine sent a team to do a report on Alice Lloyd College. The two men who were reporting stayed in our house for several days while doing research for the article that they published a few months later. My brothers, who are nearly 3 years younger than I, also remember things, and so I wanted to report those as well. Finding a dead copperhead down by Caney Creek and examining it, which led to a lifelong fascination with snakes with my brothers, especially the poisonous ones. Not me, I don't like them. In the late 1960s, when my dad was president of Texas Southmost College in Brownsville, Texas, the college there had a biological station high up in the eastern Sierra Madre of northeastern Mexico. One time we boys were allowed to accompany the college team and scientists who went there, and my brothers found a coral snake at a higher elevation than science had thought possible until then. So they made scientific history. My brothers remember hiking up above our house to a place called High Rocks and swinging on the vines growing up into the tall trees. I remember that too. Steve recalls being paddled at school with other boys for chasing the girls on the playground with their belts. We all remember being part of the marble playing bunch on the playground, among the boys at least. I remember being paddled in front of my class in 7th grade at Beaver Creek School for failure to stop talking when asked to do so. I still remember that it was more humiliating than painful. My brothers recall staying at the home of Harlan Sloan, one of the workmen from the college, where they enjoyed massive breakfasts by their host that included things like ham, beans, chicken, biscuits, gravy, the works of a mountain repast. Steve and Marty also recall being allowed, at the age of 7 or 8, to shoot shotguns and .22 rifles off Harlan's back porch. Another time, Marty remembers staying with a different college employee in his house. Of course, these people were very hospitable. The house had dirt floors and chickens were walking in and out of the house. And then walking from the college up the holler, he remembers passing some people sitting on their porch who warned, "There's a gorilla loose in these woods, escaped from a zoo." Of course, Marty was terrified. After the visit, the host insisted on walking him home, and as they parted just before our house, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a nickel, saying apologetically, "I'd like to give you more, but right now, this is the last I got." Mountain generosity at its best. Well over 50 years have passed since we moved away from Pippa Passes and Caney Creek in 1966. As I've said, my 3 years there changed me in very profound ways. When we moved to Austin, Texas in the summer of 1966, I was behind both educationally and culturally. The nation was in the full swing of the counterculture, pop music, hippies, Vietnam, demonstrations, all of that. But in the mountains, that had mostly passed me by. Re-entering the mainstream wasn't easy. It was quite startling, actually. And enrolling at Pierce Junior High as an 8th grader and going from a single classroom to multiple teachers in classrooms was also a huge adjustment. To some of the Texas kids, I was a backward mountain boy who had no clue how to talk, dress, or act cool. Though I did make friends, especially at the Lutheran church we began attending, I received a fair amount of deliberate and relentless ridicule from some of the cool crowd at school. Even at that age, 13, 14, I couldn't see why anyone would go out of their way to shame and degrade someone who was really no threat and was struggling to just get by day. I think it was that experience that has forever made me suspicious of elites and the crowd that is fixated on being superior, cool, fitting in, and dominating everybody else. I decided that I had no use for shallow and cruel people and that it was best to just be myself. My experience as an outsider, first in Appalachia and then in hip and happening Austin, and later on the Mexican border in Brownsville, created the sympathy in me for those out of place and out of step. And that has made a huge difference in the trajectory of my life since then, and it instilled a fascination for culture and relating to people from other ways of life. My doctorate in cross-cultural theological e-learning, my years of various types of Christian ministry, my more than 30 trips to teach Christian leaders in developing countries like Haiti, the Congo, South Africa, Mexico, and other places grew out of that fascination. I am forever grateful for the path that my Lord has led me down. I am truly rich, truly blessed. And by the way, thank you, Caney Creek and Eastern Kentucky. This is Dr. Michael Bogart for Aspect Ministries. I hope you enjoyed this biographical video.